All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Tammy Katz, Requirement Working Group Chair. I'm here with Lou Wheatcroft, our co-chair. And today we're having a Requirement Working Group Exchange Cafe, and we're very excited to have you all join us. This is a more informal conversation. So if you're comfortable, you're welcome to show your video, be a presence here. And I'd really like to encourage communication and questions. Now, Lou will be facilitating today's event, but I just wanted to give a brief highlight of how things went with our IW. That was in January. We did about a month ago meet. First, we had a set of pre-event series of virtual meetings for 2 days where we had a lot of great speakers, and I would encourage folks to check out our YouTube channel. We did post an IW 2022 playlist there, and we're pretty happy about the quality of speakers and the engagement we had for several sessions before the IW. And then at the IW, I hosted an in-person hybrid event where we had quite a few folks either in the room or online join us for a couple hours of discussion, how the Requirements Working Group has evolved throughout the year, what kind of products we've been putting together, and the direction we'll be going through for this next year. Now, just to highlight our plans for 2022, if you've not heard, our Needs and Requirements Manual is in the Cozy store now, and I strongly suggest you download it, give it a look over. We are going to release our 2 guides. The Guide to Needs and Requirements and the Guide to Verification and Validation are going to come out by April. And we're going to refresh the manual at that point, just kind of sync everything up a little better. And we're also going to refresh the Guide to Writing Requirements. So all of our products will come out again in a slightly fresher look or a brand new look in April. And then at that point, we're really welcoming folks to apply this information, give us feedback, let us know, with this material out there, what has worked for you, what you find missing, what you find great. We want to continue to improve it over time. So user feedback will be strongly important to enable that. As well as over the next year, we're going to have a series of monthly get-togethers virtually like this one. We're going to rotate. This month is an Exchange Cafe. Next month will be a guest speaker, and we'll continue that pattern throughout the year. And we might take a break during the International Symposium and maybe not have something set up for June, but our plan is to continue on the conversation all throughout the year. So guest speakers will be great because they can present some ideas and new ways of thinking about things or practicing needs and requirements efforts. And then our Exchange Cafes are great because we get to hear from a lot of our users, our members, folks who have great ideas, and we can actually have more of a dialogue. And that's really what today's about. So thank you for joining us. The only other news I have for you is we're getting an external website refresh. We finally got the edit option for the Requirements Working Group website. So my next announcement to the community, we'll send everybody a link to that. It'll be public, just like our YouTube channel. So we'll have a lot of information that can go out to folks. But for those who wish to be very actively involved, there's even more information internal with the Yammer site and our intranet site that we'll be building up. Lou, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, I'm glad that Tammy just mentioned the Yammer site. The whole concept of Exchange Cafes is to be able to have a conversation concerning needs, requirements, verification, validation, like if we were all sitting around the table at a pub or something like that. But in between our sessions, questions may come up, and the Yammer site is designed to allow us to have a continuous conversation amongst members on the same topic. So if you have a question about something and you like a little bit of clarification or help with something, feel free to use that Yammer site. Everyone was sent an invitation to join the Yammer site, and then you can join the Requirements Working Group community. There's also provisions there where you can set up announcements. So when someone does comment, ask a question, post something on our Yammer site, you can get a notification of that also, either as a badge on your Yammer app on your phone or iPad or something, or you can get an email to the email address they gave you to let you know that someone has posted something. So we'd like to continue this conversation, not just discreetly during these monthly sessions, but also in between using the Yammer site. So we hope to have more engagement in 2022. I want to open it up to the folks that are online. If anyone has a specific topic you'd like to talk about, comment on our products, an issue you're having at work that you'd like help with, anything to do with needs, requirements, verification, validation, feel free to speak up.
This is Craig. I have a simple question to begin. I was looking at needs verification and needs validation in the needs requirements V&V lifecycle, and it said that there's an example needs validation inspection checklist included in the Guide to Needs and Requirements Appendix D. And in the copy I have, there isn't an Appendix D, and I thought that maybe this is because you're about to submit a new version of it, and in the new version there is an Appendix D.
Greg, you have the manual. You don't have the guide. We haven't released the guide yet.
Okay.
That's one of the products coming out in April. Sorry,
Okay.
Lou, go ahead.
Some of the detail like that is being put into the guide. In the case of the checklists that are referenced in the manual, it says, see the Guide to Needs and Requirements, Appendix D, not the manual Appendix D. So that might have been a confusion. But Tammy has a checklist in there for several different things that's involved in verification, validation of the needs, the requirements, and some of the things concerned with managing needs and requirements as well.
Craig, do you have access to our INCOSE Requirement Working Group Connect site?
Yes.
That's where I have a draft of the guide posted. It's certainly getting updated. I asked for all comments by the end of February, so you still have time to get some in. We're going to be incorporating comments throughout March for both guides, the Guide to Needs and Requirements and the Guide to Verification and Validation. And then we're going to be putting those guides in the store by the end of March.
Okay, thank you. I thought it might have been something like that. I was either referencing wrong version or wrong document.
When you're going through the manual, if anyone finds any typos, editorial kind of things, we can sure address those when we release the next version along with the guides. And so there'd be an opportunity to fix anything like that we may have overlooked. I know it's really hard in catching everything. And every time I review it, I find something I missed the previous time. So all the eyes that we can get on there, great. Just send me an email if you find anything like that.
In the last review, quick review that we had 1 month ago, I don't remember exactly, 3-4 minor typos were found, and I sent the information to Wolfgang just to have him informed about this thing. But there were minor fix. Really. And another thing that I can give you feedback about is that I used the guidelines and the manual to set up some parts of the V&V guidelines within my company. And I have a couple of really fundamental questions. And I found them very useful to address the right concept. And I also inserted into our internal guidelines the 2 manuals as reference. And there's one thing that happened is that 2 of my top managers asked for the documents, and I said to be patient as soon as they will be published officially. But so the first thing is that they worked because they sustained the fundamentals of application, also in a tailored internal guideline, and for internal guideline to company. And the second thing is that once you make advertisement of it, people get interested into reading them. These are good news.
Very good. And we've had several people tell us they've already started using parts of our products internal to their companies. You know, some of the figures they'll actually print out in the poster and put on the wall and use it in their internal training. So that's a great compliment. You know, validation the working group's doing to further the practice of system engineering from the perspective of needs, requirements, verification, validation.
The work was great. That's why it worked. That's why it's useful. What you did and what the person who cooperated is great work. That's why it works.
Thank you.
Lou, I have a printout of the various verification and validation types in my office, and I get comments on that a lot. So I love printing it out into a little poster size and hanging it up, and people can just walk by and say, hey, what is this? Oh, there are different kinds of verification. What is validation compared to verification? It's easy to start the conversation just using that visual. So I get a lot of great comments on that, both at the IW and at my own office.
That figure she's talking about is where we talk about verification, validation, and context. There's a PDF of the figure that is on the Yammer site, and also I put a copy of it in the IDB22 on the Connect side of files. And so any of you can have access to those sites, you can get a copy of that. And I also just posted on Yammer high-level description of that figure also. And a version of that figure is going to actually be added to the System Engineering Handbook, but its title is going to be different. It's going to be the technical process in context. And the focus is showing how the technical processes all play together iteratively and recursively as we're developing our systems. Okay, who has another question?
Hey Lou, I just wanted to say thank you for sharing the draft with me. I think more than a year back. I'm actually working for Stryker, and the timing was perfect because around last year we started working on a corporate level initiative to get more consistent rules and best practices for requirements. When you have to get the context that Stryker as a med device company, we just do design inputs. So people are very familiar with user needs and design inputs, but just the word requirements would throw people off by a lot. So, but for the corporate level initiative, this was a great starting point for us. Initially we were all okay, we need to really reinvent the wheels. We know what INCOSE says, but then we need to come up with different examples that actually work for med device, right? But then the needs and requirements really made our life a lot easier. All of us, I think we were representatives from 10, 12 divisions, and we just read this draft and we were perfect. This just made our life so much easier. We had some great conversations going, and we were actually working on a draft that actually is very, very heavily based on this. We figured this is the gold standard. We don't have to do anything extra. We just had to put in our own examples based on this, and it's in a great spot right now. So thank you so much for this.
And you're quite welcome. And that's one of the reasons why Cammie's working on the guide for needs and requirements, and Raymond's working on the guide to V&V, so that the manual has so much information in it and detailed explanation of things that from an actual guideline to be used in an organization, a more condensed version would be helpful, and then people can refer to the manual. So, like some of you already talked about, you have internal guides that you're developing for your company, and that's the intent of all of this, is so that you can tailor specifics to your company. When the guides come out, then you can start with the guide as a template, and then you can add your own examples in it. You can tailor it to your own processes and make it easier for you to develop internal guides for your companies. And that's our ultimate goal, is to help you do that. The word design input requirements comes from the medical device world, but I think it really communicates things well to everybody, because when you just use the word requirements, it's really ambiguous if you don't use some kind of a modifier in front of it, just like verification, validation. So instead, design input requirements, and it's much clearer exactly what you're talking about. So the manual stresses and the guides stress that approach to try to make things less ambiguous and make it a little bit clearer when we're communicating different artifacts be involved in developing products.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I have a question that was raised during a recent meeting in another working group in the context of addressing the comments for the Systems Engineering Handbook Edition 5, and to be specific about the technical management processes, the project planning process. And the question was, in the current Systems Engineering Handbook, we have decomposed the requirements in business requirements, stakeholder requirements, and systems requirements. And then if we have subsystems, then we can further continue this decomposition. And we wonder if we need to consider also project requirement, and if yes, where they should stay. Shall they stay between stakeholder requirements and system requirements, or where we should put those? And if not, why not?
Very good question. When you're talking the business analysis phase, they're already doing that high level work at the enterprise level. They're really doing the front end work that you do before you institute a project. And so they're going to have expectations for not only the product being developed, but they're going to have requirements on the project itself. So you're going to have project requirements and system requirements that are defined for the business part of it. Then those are further elaborated as part of the stakeholder needs and stakeholder requirements process. But again, those can apply to a solution class, which can include both the project team and the actual product or service that you're developing. for those two, out of that, and we look at the different lifecycle concepts, one of the concepts can be how you're going to manage the project. And so it's normal for you to have those kind of requirements. If I'm going to outsource the development of my system to a supplier, then I'm going to have to write both a set of technical requirements for product, but also I have to write statement of work requirements that apply to the project. At both those business level and the stakeholder needs and requirements level, you're going to have those requirements. Now, one thing that we emphasize both in the update to the System Engineering Handbook and in the manual is that when you read stakeholder needs and requirements, they aren't one entity, they're two totally different things. The stakeholder needs are the stakeholder perspective of what they need from a product or service. Could be what they need from a project as well. And then stakeholder requirements really is a shorthand for stakeholder-owned system requirements. So it's common for stakeholders, like a customer, to have needs, but also for them to transform their needs into their own requirements. So it's more accurate to say stakeholder needs and stakeholder-owned system requirements because they're really communicating the two different perspectives. But one thing that we emphasize is that there are multiple stakeholders. And so you can have multiple sets of stakeholder needs and multiple sets of stakeholder requirements. Part of the whole process described in the manual is taking all those inputs from the different stakeholders and then coming up with lifecycle concepts. And you'll see in the manual, when we go through out of the lifecycle concepts, you'll see that there's three classes of needs. There's needs for the project, there's needs for processes, and there's needs for the system. And then the manual, we make a point that the needs for the project and the needs for the processes are out of scope of the manual. But they definitely are going to be part of that process because you need to have lifecycle concepts for how you're going to manage the project, how you're going to do acquisition, how you're going to actually do verification validation, how you're going to do the design. So there can be a lot of concepts for that. And then part of that concept definition, if you are going to hire a supplier, is deciding exactly what type of contract you're going to have, what are your deliverables, and really the source material for you to write a statement of work. As far as you're saying, you have both sets of requirements, actually three: process, people, and project, and then the product.
I think you confirm my understanding, saying that there are also other types of requirements that actually are out of scope of the manual. And this is actually what triggered the discussion in that context, because if we say that, for instance, in the manual and then also in the Systems Engineering Handbook Edition 5, the project requirements are out of scope of this document, then the natural question is, why do we talk about project planning in the technical management processes and we do not talk about systems engineering management or planning systems engineering effort? So I see that an inconsistency, and also how I can say a risk to have let's say challenges with other communities, because when I talk to project managers, they talk about project requirements. When I talk to business analysts, they talk about business requirements. And if we do not clarify this context, then it is difficult to integrate these three roles in an efficient and effective manner. So somehow I'm struggling to see a very clear, coherent flow from the technical processes and the technical management processes.
From a project management standpoint, I have the Project Management Institute, and you're not the only one having those concerns. And so the Project Management Institute and INCOSE have combined together, and they've produced a product that addresses both project management and system engineering. I forget the name of the document, but they produced a document that addresses that so that all the details of project management are really left to the PMI PMBOK and then into the System Engineering Handbook. But then you talked about business analysts. They have a different organization, the International Institute of Business Analysts, and they have their own book of knowledge, and they define, processes. And typically the business analyst is focused on internal software projects that are being developed within the company. And the business analyst is a go-between between the internal company stakeholders and the internal company project team that's going to develop an application. And so the context of that's a little bit different. And some organizations, rather than thinking about systems engineering, they think about product development. And there's actually another organization, associated with product development that has their own set of products that are parallel basically to what we do in system engineering. So when you're going through different companies and then people move from one company to the other, they may be more familiar with one of those other views than what's presented in the system engineering handbook for systems engineering. And so the manual focuses more on key activities that you would perform in any context. Like business requirements aren't well defined in the handbook, I agree. So it would be nice to make that differentiation. One thing I would like to do personally is in the past, I've taught classes on writing statement of work requirements, writing statement of works. When all of our products kind of settle down, a new product I'd like to start on is the one writing effective performance-based statement of works, with the focus on requirements.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
That was a great question. And Craig added on about the figure in the manual 2.3, where it does talk about the different levels of requirements and the hierarchy and business requirements are in there. And the question was, would project requirements fit within the business operations level view? Is it synonymous with business requirements?
Well, if I can say my opinion, I think we have organization and they have business/mission requirements, so very long-term and business-oriented requirements. Within those organizations, we can run programs within program projects. So we can have program requirements, project requirements, and then from project, we can get products to be delivered. And then the next question would be, which is the difference between products and system? That was already discussed last time. And I think it was Craig who answered that system is basically a combination of product, people, and processes, which I agree. But then basically they are, let's say, developed within project and programs and by organizations with their own business and missions. That is my understanding. However, the lifetime of them are different. So the lifetime of a project is different from a lifetime of a system, because usually the system lifetime is longer. And this basically makes a difference between what I call project stakeholders and system stakeholders. So a systems engineer has a different view respect from a project manager, because he tries to satisfy different types of stakeholders. There is an overlap, but they are not always the same, because the two life cycles are different. So that is my view, and somehow I would like that this is captured somehow.
It is, and that's one of the areas of confusion in the way the lifecycle concepts are communicated in 15288. The technical processes are communicated. When it says stakeholder needs and requirements, that doesn't mean that that's the only place stakeholders are involved. Stakeholders are involved at all levels. They're involved at the business level, the business operations level, the system level. And like you say, there's different sets of stakeholders. So at the higher levels of the organization, you'll have stakeholders that are concerned with both the program project management side of things, as well as the system, the product to be developed as well. In the PMBOK, the Project Management Institute document, they talk about two different kinds of scope. They talk about scope for the product that's going to be developed, and then scope for the organization that's actually going to develop the product. And so when you're talking about the different kinds of requirements, you talk about the requirements on the people developing the product as well as requirements for the product. So you have the project management kind of requirements, and you have the technical system requirements, and so they're different. And the manual does talk about those different kind of requirements in section 2. So when you use the word requirements, are you talking about one or the other? One of the problems that I had in certain organizations, especially in the construction industry, is they'll put out a statement of work and they'll have requirements on the contractor interspersed with requirements on the product. And then they write both of them in passive voice. So it's not really clear which one applies to which. It's one of my pet peeves when I'm teaching statement of work classes. You shouldn't mix up the people requirements and the product requirements in the same document. They could be in the same document, but they need to be segregated in some separate areas. So clear the people requirements have activities and deliverables, and then the product requirements communicating something different.
Yes, this is Jeff Williams. First off, glad to see that y'all are putting out the new manuals. They're coming for me in a very timely manner. is I'm putting together a requirements engineering course at our local university. I plan to definitely download them. Luckily, the university is also a major supporter of INCOSE, so all the stuff is online for them as well and for the students. Your statement about the mixing of requirements is a common problem that I see and I've seen for decades. I don't know that it's going to go away anytime soon because that's an education problem. So it's just something we have to work on continually. The different types of requirements, you talked about the organization and you talked about the product. Most individuals do not understand, I'm going to make an accusation, that in the process, you're designing two systems. You're first designing the organic system known as the organization that is going to produce the end product. It has a set of requirements associated with it. Those begin at the customer level. When you start looking at the stakeholder, they have management enterprise level requirements on down. All of those stakeholders all the way down to the individual developers and verifiers. I'll use that terminology just to simplify because they're at the bottom of the stakeholder list. Not that they're not important, but they have requirements that are going to impact the design of the organization. Too often we do not consider the design of the organization as we lay out our product, what we're going to do and how we're going to develop this product. Yes, you have product requirements and yes, you have design for product, but you are designing two different systems. And the organization part of that is going to evolve over time as the product is developed and as the needs for the environment, because you're going to develop enabling systems, things of that nature, and the need of the organization are going to change. And that's going to cause changes in an evolution in the organic system, which is the program organization. Now, that's something that I don't see us often discussing. Of course, it's a pet topic of mine, as you probably picked up on.
It's one of mine too. And I used to work with Ivy Hooks, and she was involved in INCOSE a long time ago. And we taught classes for our clients, and we kept running into that so much. We had to develop a separate course we called Performance-Based Statement of Work that would focus on the requirements for the organization in addition to the requirements for the product. And even though the rules for writing requirements are similar, there's a lot of differences in the wording. There's a lot of other considerations that have to take place, especially in a customer-supplier relationship. The terms verification validation apply, but they're applied differently. And so they need to understand what the differences of those are. It gets under the world of contract management in some cases. So yeah, it's got to be different. In the manual, when we're doing the lifecycle concept analysis and maturation, you'll see that I list almost as many project management artifacts as I do system engineering artifacts. And I talk about a collaborative team that's made up of both a project management team as well as a system engineering team working concurrently. Have a client right now that I mentioned, wouldn't it be easier for you to manage your project if you could take a product breakdown structure and map it directly to a work breakdown structure? Light bulb came into his head and he really liked that idea, so he could better manage things. But yeah, they're two different sides of the same coin. That's why PMI and INCOSE got together, realizing that. So, but a lot of system engineers, they kind of work in the silo and they let the project management side happen to, somewhere else. And I see you shaking your head, and unfortunately, that happens too often. So thank you for your comment.
Yes, the best thing you can do is take your systems lead and put him into a critical position with the PM and your chief engineers and stuff like that, so that they're intimately involved in the ongoings of the program. That doesn't solve all the things I just talked about, but if you don't do that, you're going to run into issues.
Especially if the engineers don't think they have to worry about cost and schedule.
Isn't cost and schedule a design constraint?
Yes, they are.
So if I'm going to engineer a product, don't I need to know my design constraints?
You would think.
Okay.
Those are part of the drivers and constraints that, are addressed in our manual and guides up front to identify those.
If I bring an experience about this, until a few years ago, it was crystal clear the distinction among the system and the product, especially when it's the first products are delivered and already working on the market. And because there were the so-called platforms that were physically represented by persons with their skills that took care of the system and the evolution of the system during its life cycle. Today, what happens is that with more agile techniques, there are a lot of projects or development activities, because today it's forbidden to use projects in agile, and that care about the same product and sometimes about really the same system, and with very, very fantasy names. And this brings some confusion because there are different persons with not all the background, not all the knowledge. That is so difficult to take care about it. And obviously there are the frameworks that help, but this brings some unclarity about really what is and what is not. Yeah, you are touching the drawings, the design, but you forget that there is something of the market which is running.
Yes. Okay, good discussions. We got about 15 minutes left, a little bit more. Anyone else want to speak up and bring up a topic to talk about?
I noticed Raymond Wolfgang joined us, and Raymond, anything you've learned on your journey working on the guide to V&V that would be interesting to share? Put you on the spot, but you know, I've learned a few things too. I was just curious what your perspective was.
No, that's a great question. I think the biggest call to value add was that it sort of parsed out different aspects of the whole verification and validation program that, you know, was kind of in my head there, but I didn't identify it as a separate event. Now, for instance, requirements verification. Okay, well, that's verifying a requirement matches, you know, certain syntax rules. You're verifying that as, you know, a proper requirement. Okay, well, we did that. We called that necessarily, but okay, so an activity I know now has a home in this larger context. Okay, it's super. Now, the other thing we used to call requirements verification, which is really, we're calling it system verification. We run a test. Oh, it passes this test. Great, we meet this functional or environmental requirement, or a combination thereof. So great. Okay, well, now that lives in product verification. So the big thing I learned there was that most people, most colleagues I work with, even senior people, you know, they sort of know all the different activities, but they all call it slightly different things. And I did not appreciate the fact that everyone else's sort of requirements vocabulary. I know ontology is a fighting word, so I'll avoid that one. But the vocabulary and how the terms interact with each other is just slightly different. It's not radically different, because that's easy to spot, but it's slightly enough different where, you know, you'll make an ask and say, hey, we need to finish our requirements verification. Says, wow, well, that's not till after our design review. It's like, whoa, wait a sec. So it's one of the benefits, I'm able to spot these gaps earlier, and then you have a conversation and basically have everyone leave the meeting with the same thing in their head. That had not always happened.
Raymond, also the idea of V&V. We kept saying V&V all the time. And what did we mean by V&V? And was it really validation too, in addition to verification? So I think even though it's easier to say V&V, I think it's more precise to say what you're really talking about. You know, were you verifying? Are you validating? And what is it you're specifically validating? So stop trying to mush all that together into a single term, I think was really eye-opening for me when we started having those conversations.
Yeah, as well. Although there's a tinge of sadness there, because I too was guilty of, you know, maybe not really thinking through what I exactly meant, but I knew V&V would cover it because it was.
You know what? It's true. It's global. It's a superset. It'll be in there. But then when you're talking about your planning of your tasks and your very specific things and your phasing, all of a sudden, like you said, was I talking about requirement verification or product verification? Am I talking about system validation? It really does matter when you're dealing with your actual activities you're going to be doing and you're planning for them.
Well, let's make it worse. Let's add IV&V into the equation. And then people think of that as a single thing that happens in the right side of the V. And you see in the manual, I really kind of took out the V. I mentioned it in one place up front in context, but in a lot of places I found it was a lot clearer not to mention left or right side of the V. We do things, design, verification, validation, which is part of early verification validation. And then we do verification validation. In the chat, Carlo wrote in there, no more V&V. And it really is important because they are distinct activities. And one of the big drivers for moving to needs and requirements instead of just requirements is to make it clear that we verify a system against the requirements, but we validate it against the needs. And the needs could be communicated in several forms, but they're two different activities, and they often are done by different groups of people. And that's one of the problems I have with some people say, well, the customers never gave us their needs, they just gave us requirements. So all we can do is verification. But if they don't understand the customer's real needs, they can meet the requirements, but actually still deliver the wrong thing. So I think it's an inherent responsibility of systems engineers, even if that stakeholder view, customer view from a need standpoint aren't communicated, the suppliers, the developers need to understand what that is. I was working with an organization and their development team worked really hard to deliver a horse, but their customer wanted a unicorn. Similar, but not the same. And so in reality, they should have been aware that the customer wanted the unicorn from the beginning and every step of the way. And that's why this verification, validation, and context is important. You're always validating against the needs that communicate the unicorn. So you never lose sight of what it is you're supposed to be developing. Even if your contract's based on meeting a set of requirements, you can never lose sight what the customer really needed. And terminology is such a big, important thing that Raymond broke out. So there's several different misuses of words, whereas engineers were a little bit sloppy. And just like Raymond, I had the same definition of things before we started this journey, and I've learned so much from it. But in section 1 of the manual, it goes through several different classes of areas of communication problems. Like, what's the difference between a requirement specification versus a document specification? And we already talked about design inputs. We try to define a common set of terms that's used throughout the manual so that when you see those terms, no matter where you are, it should be clear what we're talking about. Carlo, were you to say something?
Yeah, absolutely true. In my personal experience, the times that specific customers expressed requirements that were not needs, they were requirements, full requirements. There were very tricky times to make a reasonable design because they lose the systemic view and they tend to lose that. They focus only on one aspect typically or more, couple of aspects. And that makes the design completely unbalanced and the system at the end of the story is not satisfactory also to the customer that expressed these very specific requirements. So it's important for the system engineer, and here there is a connection with the discussion before. Approach of a project manager. The project manager receives something very, very specific. He's happy because he says, hey guys, the customer asked for this target, finished, okay? For him, is an order, okay? For the system engineer, it's a need, should be a need, and eventually to be better understood. Why do you need this specific number, this specific performance? What value does it bring to you? What loss can mean for you? So it's important to have this different really attitude versus what the customer express, and if there is a need which is more unclear, more general, a bit fluffy, but expresses a need rather than with the very, very pointy, then you must satisfy it, but understand why you satisfy it. You have to satisfy it.
And that's a big focus of section 4 of the manual, is that you treat the customer requirements along with any other requirements and needs that you get from various stakeholders as inputs. And then you go through analysis to clear up inconsistencies, things that are missing, some drivers constraints maybe defined. And you do a lot of work up front, more work up front, to see is there a feasible way to actually meet the true expectations for the product. And then with all that work, now you have the underlying analysis that you can actually define a set of needs and then use that analysis to transform those into the set of design input requirements. In the past, a lot of people were this acquisition model that they're used to just being handed a set of requirements, and then they did requirements analysis to come up with a design. You really need to go way before those requirements. And there's a lot of work to be done first. So section 4 of the manual really concentrated on all that work that needs to be done before a supplier actually develops a set of requirements.
And this work done underneath is fundamental to make a successful system that at the end of the story delivers products of the market which are useful and deliver value. Because if you don't do that type of work, you deliver something that at the moment satisfies all the requirements if you are good enough. But typically that doesn't last a long time. At least this is my experience. Okay?
I totally agree.
Yeah, it's a good point, Carlo. In fact, the phrase sometimes we hear is, well, you as an organization, you should have thought of that. You should have realized it was missing and put it in there. We're paying you the big money. How can you just, so it tends to be, no matter what the customer leaves out. So sometimes we as, in a good way, we're viewed as these subject matter experts. If there's a gap, a lot of times the last thing we can do is say, well, it was really your fault. That's a poor form, and that also won't last, I humbly submit.
Well, it'll hit your business model, right? You can do great on one project and secure that business, but future customers won't come if they can see a history of not being able to deliver what they really want versus maybe what they specified.
Oh yeah, and they all talk to each other too. There are no secrets at a certain level.
I have the saying, I say writing requirements is not an exercise in writing, it's an exercise in engineering. And so
That's right.
One thing I like about the MBSE world is it gives us more analysis tools that we can use early. So rather than taking a set of requirements and developing a model from the requirements, we're going to go and start developing our models at the beginning of the project as a way to assess all the inputs from the different stakeholders. And when you start modeling things, you look at functions and you say, oh, all the functions have inputs and have outputs. And what's the flow of information? Oh, they didn't talk about that function, but you got to have that function. You can't do this other function. And you start finding the missing requirements, and there's going to be inconsistencies and so on that we have that different analysis can uncover. And in a modeling approach, we have now the tools to do that underlying analysis to help ensure correctness, consistency, and completeness that we really didn't have before. Because if you just sat down with a bunch of people writing words on a piece of paper, calling those requirements, but they haven't done the underlying analysis, you really got a poor set of requirements that's going to create problems.
I have talked to my customers and said, I don't understand this requirement. Do you mind if we walk through the use case?
Yes.
Now, these are the things that make up a valuable use case.
Right.
Let's walk through it. And you'd be surprised at the number of times they go, well, we haven't thought about that.
Yep.
I've had that happen to me many times. Gentlemen and ladies and gentlemen, I hate to drop off, but I have another meeting I have to jump on.
Yeah.
Thanks for contributing. Good luck on your class.
This has been a good discussion. Our time's up. I want to thank everybody. And like Tammy said, we'll be putting out an announcement for the presentation next month. And then we'll have another Exchange Cafe. Topics like this that are of interest, if you have a question, start using Yammer and posting those topics. And then we can have discussions. And then we want to expand those discussions into the cafes, then we can.
I thought we had a hand raised. John, was that you?
Hi, Lou. Hi, Tammy, and everyone. Great to be with you again. Just really briefly, I think a month ago, Lou, you sent out an email or a call for topics for cafes in the future. And I do have one that we talked about and I want to do in the future. Basically, I've summarized it here and then I'll quit. I want to do a survey. And the question of the survey is, which process should output the trained operators and maintainers, the implementation process or the transition process? And I'd like to get your feedback on that at the future time. So just a little more detail in 1528, 2015 and INCOSE Handbook version 4, 2015, humans are considered as systems elements. And in 1528, system elements are realized, quote unquote, and output by the implementation process and integrated by the integration process. However, in the SE Handbook version 4, trained operators and maintainers are output by the transition process. So the question in my survey is, which process should output the trained operators and maintainers, the implementation process or the transition process?
Part of it's deliverables and so on. You really got to start back at the beginning. The maintainers or the maintenance view could drive requirements. And so I need to define that concept up front, especially in the medical device world. It's very important that you do the use FMEAs, how the operator is actually going to interact with the system. You define that up front so you can identify risk and look at your instructions for use early. Don't wait until the end. You want to do it at the beginning because some of the risks that you're going to mitigate may be done by process and what's in the instruction for use. In training, maybe how you're going to mitigate a risk, as well as how you design the system. So concepts for user interaction need to be addressed at the beginning. I don't want to wait till the end, to address those things.
So Lou, is this a good follow-up for a future cafe as we've reached the end of our time?
Yes, I think it would be.
I think so too. And I really appreciate, John, that you gave us that suggestion. We're going to make a note on that.
Something to think about in the meantime.
Excellent. And as I said at the beginning, the next month will be a guest speaker. I'm still firming it up, so I can't quite announce it just yet. So we'll get a guest speaker coming up for March, and then our next cafe will be in April.
And so thank you, everybody, for attending. And hopefully we'll be talking to you on Yammer.
Yes, if we missed any questions today, I think someone said in the chat, they'll post them on Yammer. Yes, please do. We want to keep this conversation more than every other month. So please use Yammer for observations, questions, feedback on content. We are happy to keep that dialogue going. I think that's the best way this working group can communicate. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. I really appreciated this discussion.